the vibe is a real phenomenon, a real experience. And then the question then becomes, how do we investigate this, understand this, and then elevate the vibe to a conscious way of life?
Hello, and welcome to the Mindset and Self-Mastery Show. I'm your host, Nick McGowan, and today on the show, I have Jason Del Gandio. Jason, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm good, man. I'm excited you're on. You did share with me that thing that's interesting, and I'm really excited for you to share with that. I'm not even going to go any further. So before we get into any of that stuff, why don't you tell us, what do you do for a living? And what's one thing that most people don't know about you? It's a little odd or bizarre.
Sure. So once again, my name is Jason Del Gandio. I'm a college professor at Temple University in Philadelphia. And at Temple, my expertise is the theory and practice of social justice with a focus on activism and social movements. So I essentially study how human beings create social change. However, outside of Temple, my other expertise is the vibe or vibes in the plural. When I say vibe, in other words, the exchange of energy between you and other people. So again, the exchange of energy between you and other people. I know it sounds strange and whatnot to study the vibe, but I've actually been studying it since my late teens. So at this point, it's about 30 years ago, I started thinking about this. And I approach the vibe as a site of intellectual investigation. And I try to help people articulate their experience of the vibe into ideas, into words, into a language that makes sense to them. Right? Then in terms of one strange thing about me that most people don't know about. So I have a tattoo of a rival football team. So I'm a huge NFL fan, and my team that I root for since I was a little kid, since I was 11 years old, is New York Giants. One of their rivals is the Philadelphia Eagles. And so as I just said, I live in Philadelphia, around Philly, and I lost a bet a few years back. So I think it was 2017, the Eagles won the Super Bowl. One of my best friends is an Eagles fan, and we had a bet on the game. And I said, if they win the Super Bowl, I'll get a tattoo of the Eagles. Lo and behold, they win the game, and now I am forever branded with a team that I hate and despise on my body, right? Now, I usually forget that I even have it. So it's on my back, my upper right back. And I got it there on purpose so I don't have to see it, right? But now it's getting warm out. Go to the beach, you're in the pool. And down here, everyone's an Eagles fan down here. So go Birds, go Eagles. Go Birds. Right, that's exactly right. And so I often forget. I'm sitting on the beach, for instance, I forget that I have this on me. Someone walks by, go Birds. I'm like, oh, God damn it. It's like, now, of course, my buddy Michael, who I had the bet with, he thinks it's hilarious, this, that, and the other thing. He actually came to the tattoo shop when I got the tattoo, all these kinds of things. But anyway, that's me. I got a tattoo of the rival football team that I hate on my body for life.
Well, folks, thank you for listening to the podcast episode today. We appreciate your time. When you told me that before we hit record, I was like, fuck, that is gold. Thank God. So please, your buddy has no idea who I am, but just shake his hand for me.
Okay.
Just please, from one Philly fan to another. But at the same time, dude, like, I totally understand where you're like, fine, if they win the Super Bowl, which they hadn't since it was a championship game in 60?
Something like that.
I could almost see that conversation of like, fine, fuck you. If they win the Super Bowl, I'll get a fucking tattoo.
That's how it went. Actually, I made the bet back in June. So like before training camp started, he's talking all this kind of smack. The Eagles are going to win the Super Bowl. Like, get out. They're not winning the Super Bowl. No one had to pick to win the division. Then, of course, I don't know if you remember, they start the season, I think it was 10-0 or 11-0. And I'm like, I'm screwed, dude. I'm totally screwed. But then the starting quarterback gets hurt, tears his ACL. I'm like, I'm golden. I got nothing to worry about. Nick Foles comes in, the quarterback, and then and here I am. Here I am. So it was a rough call.
That was one hell of a run, though.
Yeah, it was. Yes.
That was like a fairy tale for Nick Foles to come back, to do that and all of that. That was almost like the Tyree catch.
Totally, yes, yeah. It shouldn't have happened. It did happen, though. And as a fan, you're like, I don't care if it's supposed to happen.
Yeah, I did.
But what do I?
Shit. Oh my God. I had just moved to Florida at that time, like maybe 4 months before that happened. And I remember standing on my porch in my condo just screaming, "Go Birds!" And people being outside like, what the fuck is wrong with this guy? It's like 7:00 at night. I'm like, yeah, losing my mind. Oh, man. So that's good on you for being the guy that actually did it. because I could see people being like, nah, man, I was only kidding.
Right.
Like, I'm not going to do that, whatever. And like, I, I think of it from like a cowboy's perspective. If I
Yeah.
did that,
Yeah.
had to have a star on me somewhere,
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know if it would be really hard to do that. Like, so good on you, man. I appreciate you bringing that up. And that's got also good on you for putting it on your back so you don't have to see it. But
Right.
people walk by, go Birch, and you're like, motherfucker. Like, just reminding. Oh, man.
Yeah, I'm not
So
happy about it, but I mean, I do pride myself on being honest, being truthful, being authentic, etc. And so I made the bet. I got to live with it. So it is what it is.
that's huge. I mean, that's huge. But I think enough of that. And you probably think the same
Yeah,
thing.
right.
Like, all right, dude, let's stop. Let's stop. Um, man, now I want to talk football. Like, I want to know your thoughts on Daniel Jones and why you guys didn't get Penix. But that's a whole different conversation. Maybe that's some other time that we have. One of the reasons why I accepted you as a guest was because of the vibes. And that's one of the things that I really want to spend the time on this podcast episode talking about that. But it's something I also want to call out kind of the shit with it, because people can think like, oh, you just feel vibes, you feel energy. Like, I don't believe that. I had a conversation with somebody recently where people will talk shit about like crystals and things that have to do that are almost like woo woo.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, like just using crystals as the example, those actually have waves. There are waves that are emitted
Sure.
in and through them. And you can ask somebody, if you don't believe in crystals, that's fine. Do you believe in radio?
Right.
Do you believe in microwaves? Like, oh yeah.
Mhm.
Like, no one's going to say no to
Right.
that. Like, yeah, I toss the hot dog in there for a minute, thing explodes. Something must be happening, you know? Um, so same thing with the vibe. Like, once I read that and I saw that info come in, my first thought was like the spidey sense. How some people will feel like that little bit of
Yeah.
tingle,
Yeah. Yeah.
but not know what to do.
Right.
And, you know, you watch enough Criminal Minds or NCIS or anything like that, there's always stuff that people are like, I had this weird feeling. Or if you watch things or talk to somebody of some situation that was about to happen, like some people can call or tell when they're about to get into a car accident or somebody's going to die or something's going to happen. And I think we're all connected. There's that quantum subconscious kind of connection that's there. But start from the beginning of this. You said you got into this as a teenager. How did you get into this? Did you feel things and you started questioning, or what happened?
Yeah, sure. So back in my early teens, so 18, 19, 20 years old, around that time, I was involved with a bunch of different subcultures or countercultures. So the early rave scene in New York City, jam bands like Fish, underground house parties, all these kinds of scenes, like wild and adventurous scenes. And in all of these scenes, all of these subcultures, people were using the word vibe all the time, right? So vibing on the DJ last night, vibing on the band, the vibe of the crowd, vibe of the dance floor, and it was also used as a way to evaluate the experience. Like, what was the vibe last night? So if you missed the party last night, you would say, was it a good vibe, right? And so at some point, I realized everyone's using this word vibe, but no one's trying to define it or explain it. And so I intuitively just kind of took an intellectual interest in understanding this thing we call the vibe. Then I wrote my first paper on the vibe as a college student in an undergraduate class on nonverbal communication. I then I went on to grad school and used my master's thesis and my doctoral dissertation to write about the vibe. And I reconceptualized the vibe as bodily emanation. In other words, the body emanates or radiates an actual tangible feeling that is experienced and felt by other bodies, right? And once we break that open, though, in terms of the philosophy of the vibe, it's not just a good vibe here and a bad vibe there, but rather it's like our bodies are constantly vibing on one another, which kind of points to a certain kind of interconnection between human bodies, right? Now, when we talk about the vibe, and I define it as the exchange of energy between you and other people, one of the questions I like to ask is like, what do we mean by this energy, right? So, is this energy physical or metaphysical? Is it material or immaterial? Is it spiritual or scientific, or perhaps all of these things and then some? And the reason why I pose it as a question like that is that I don't want to posit one paradigm to understand the vibes. Once you posit a paradigm, like a framework, then it's all we see, right? So instead, I try to invite people to think about their experience of the vibe and then try to help them to articulate their understanding of this thing we call the vibe, right? I'm not trying to act like I'm some new age guru that has all the answers, because I don't, right? But I do think the vibe is a real phenomenon, a real experience. And then the question then becomes, how do we investigate this, understand this, and then elevate the vibe to a conscious way of life?
What a cool thing for you to not only take that, be aware that people keep talking about this thing, but you took that and ran with it much further than I'm sure most other people would have. Because everybody's kind of heard like, oh, that vibe, or when the
Right,
bass hits, or when this happens, or whatever, and like what that feel was. And I've been part of those conversations. What was the vibe like last night? Sorry, I missed the party, or sorry, I missed the show. How was it? Well, the audience was great, or whatever it
right.
was. But what a cool thing for you to actually take that and run with that, because I do think that it can fit within so many different pieces. And I appreciate that you're not just trying to create a framework to go, here's a box that we should all live within, because that feeling can come from different things and different ways. So let's expand upon that a bit. What does that look like? What have you come across, and sort of what are the patterns that you've seen with people of how they've interpreted it and how they've explained their vibe?
Well, I'll actually start with some examples here, some basic examples of where people might use the word, right? So think of a first date. Right? You're on your first date with somebody, presumably a stranger or close to being a stranger. And one of the ways we try to evaluate that first date is whether or not there's a connection between us. And then that connection, though, is often translated into some kind of vibe or an energy. Like, was the vibe right between us? Now, in that situation, there could be all kinds of vibes. Maybe it was a good vibe, but it was more friendly, more platonic, not romantic. Or maybe it was just a horrible vibe. You never want to see each other again. That's possible, right? Or maybe you guys did gel and you connected, but for some reason you kind of just know, well, it's not going to work out romantically. It's just not there for us, right? So that's one example. Another example might be a heated argument between you and friends or you and family members, right? So in our society, we tend to say things like good vibes only, etc. But that's not true. There are all kinds of vibes, right? And so think about the last time you and your best friend or you and your significant other got into a really heated conversation about something, right? We disagreed. Well, that itself is its own vibe. It's a bad vibe. It's a negative vibe, and that vibe might affect you the rest of the day, for the next week, a couple of weeks, etc. All right. Another example. Think of a sporting event, right? Which is talking about sports, right? And so you're at a football game, a baseball game, a basketball game, and there are thousands, maybe tens of thousands, or even 80 or 90,000 people, right? Everyone's cheering for their team, right? And let's say it's the end of the game, you're down by a few points, everyone's watching, everyone's on their edge. All of a sudden, you get those points, whether it's touchdown, home run, and the entire stadium goes crazy. And you feel this electricity, like literally running through your body. Well, that's a vibe, right? Same kind of thing if you talk about musical concerts. You're at a concert, you're at a venue, there's tens of thousands of people there. You're all listening to the same music, the same songs, right? And then you kind of have a certain interconnection with people, a certain kind of rhythm starts to emerge throughout the entire crowd, right? And that embodied feeling, that embodied experience is itself a vibe. Then I use one more example here. So think of a work meeting, right? Let's say it's a very intense work meeting, everyone's on edge, and you kind of cut the tension with a knife, right? Well, that unspoken, nonverbal phenomenon is what I call a vibe or the exchange of energy. Right? So there's some basic examples I think most people can relate to and can understand.
So even if they can relate and understand, I think it's then doing something with it. Um, it's hard to not put ourselves in those spots when you pose those questions or those situations. Something that I think that I thought about as you were talking about it, the day that we're recording this, last night, the Nuggets, Denver Nuggets, knocked out the LA Lakers. And Jamal Murray hit basically the game winning shot within 4 or 5 seconds. The camera crew really pointed out the entire arena, not just from that shot, not the perspective from Jamal or right there on the side or even a few rows back. They made sure to be able to point out that the entire crowd was standing on its feet and you could see them all just go crazy as soon as that shot was hit. And then as soon as, 5, 6 seconds later, when the buzzer was over and like that was the end of the game and Lakers are out, they went crazy again. You feel that. I could feel that watching it through TV. I could feel it watching the game, but then I could also feel that shot, that distant shot from like the nosebleeds, watching this entire stadium erupt, I could feel that vibe. So it's not something we have to be there in that moment to be able to feel it. You can feel it from that. But what do we as people do with those things? Because we've all been in spots where you've either been in that game or you've seen it, or your team loses or your team wins, and your buddy has to get a tattoo, and there's things that have to get that. So what do we do with those? Like, how do we actually be self-aware in those moments to go, "Ooh, there's a vibe here," and then what to do with it?
Sure. So one of the related to your question is another question people often ask me. It's like, well, how do I tune into the vibe? How do I feel it? Can I use it in certain kinds of ways? And the answer is yes to all of that, right? And so I try to begin with like things that are concrete. So first, and this relates to the title of your show here, right? Um, First, be aware of your body, right? Then also be aware of your surroundings, and then be aware of the other people around you. And I say be aware of your body, surroundings, and other people is because if you're just up here all the time in your head, and you have all that psychological noise going on, that kind of cuts you off to the rest of the world, right? So how do you open up your mind, open up your senses to be more engaged with the wider world, right? And I think that itself is one step towards feeling and experiencing this thing we call the vibe, right? Then additionally, I would say try to distinguish between different modes or different levels of experience. So in this case, try to distinguish between intuition, emotions, and vibes. They're all related, but not inherently the same thing, right? If we say they're all the same thing, then it's a flat line, like everything flattens out, right? So when I say intuition, intuition is often talked about in terms of spirituality or new age spirituality, which is fine, right? But that's not true. I think we all have intuition, right? When I say intuition, in other words, you have your subconscious mind and your conscious mind. Your conscious mind is what you're focused on right here and right now. It's like a little peephole that you look through, right? So I'm focused on this interview. I'm focused on my computer screen, my camera, etc. But the entire world still exists beyond my conscious awareness, and that's where your subconscious mind comes into play. Your subconscious mind, because it is more expansive, is in touch with a larger environment. And then when you allow your subconscious mind to communicate with your conscious mind, that's what we mean by intuition, right? Your intuition is telling you something about the environment, about the situation that your conscious mind is not fully aware of at the moment. Right? So that's intuition. For emotions, that's basically a psychological response to a set of circumstances, either real or perceived, right? And then we have joy, we have fear, we have happiness, we have whatever the case may be, the whole range of emotions. Then we also have this thing we call the vibe, though. Again, it's similar to emotion, similar to intuition, but not exactly the same, right? I envision the vibe as an actual phenomenon, like I said earlier, this kind of exchange of energy, or in terms of bodily emanation, that your body emanates or radiates this tangible energy that is experienced and felt by other bodies, right? And so learning to distinguish between those three forms of experience is important. And it's not easy, though. And even for myself that's been studying this, for 30 years now, sometimes you're not sure, is this my intuition? Is this my emotions? Am I experiencing someone else's vibe? This is my vibe. So it does all get mixed up here, right? Um, then from there, though, once you kind of have a greater awareness and understanding of these different modes of experience, right, and you're tapping into the vibe, then back to your original question, what do we do with this? Right? Well, I think of the vibe as not just this vibe or that vibe, a good vibe or a bad vibe, but rather as a mode of communication, as well as a way of knowing. In other words, a way of moving through the world that we understand certain kinds of things. Right? A vibe is not neutral, but it carries with it a certain kind of information. Right? So when you walk into a room, what's the vibe of the room? Right? Is it a good vibe, a bad vibe, a tense vibe, uplifting vibe, whatever it is? Then in terms of using it more, think of the star athlete and the intangibles as we're talking about sports, right? One of the ways to evaluate great athletes is, do they have the intangibles to make the other people around them better, right? Yeah, they have the skill set of being an athlete, especially in pro sports. But the best players are able to exude a certain kind of vibe, a certain kind of energy that makes everyone around them better in that moment, especially in the big games, especially when it's a clutch moment and things like that. One other example I'll just use now before I toss it off here. Think about being a boss or a leader, right? And then what kind of vibe do you give off with the right people at the right time. It's not the same vibe all the time with all the same people, right? Some people you have to exude a certain kind of vibe. Other kinds of people exude a different kind of vibe to get the most out of them in terms of your employees, your coworkers, etc. Right? And so you can learn how to use the vibe to achieve certain kinds of ends and goals in your life.
There's a feeling within it to be able to feel that vibe. From my experience, it's not a feeling that you can really manufacture. It just you feel it or you don't feel it. Um, like as you were talking about the manager perspective or something, I think everybody's had a really great manager, hopefully, or somebody who was like at least okay, but everybody has had a really terrible manager. They've had somebody who's just been an asshole or they've been a micromanager or whatever. And I think a lot of that is probably a very vibey thing of like, oh, I just don't want to be in the same room with them. When in all reality, they may feel uncomfortable with where they're at. They may have imposter syndrome. They may just have their boss on top of them saying, you need to produce or you need to do this or whatever. I've been in sales for a long, long time, and I've seen that with different people. And I can smell that and almost feel that with other people that are trying to sell things. Like you can feel that vibe. Like a lot of people don't like salespeople because of that vibe where they're like, ooh, I'm going to get you for something. But if you don't have that vibe and you feel comfortable and somebody's not trying to actively just sell you into something, they're trying to help, it's a whole different story, whole different feeling. And as you're talking about all of this, I'm trying to figure out what's kind of the takeaway for people to be able to say, all right, I get the vibe, and great job with the definitions and kind of how things work with the emotions and intuition and all of that. I think it was really great to be able to help people separate them all, but then put them into some sort of an order in a sense. And I wonder if that works differently for people. Because my thought is, well, I can feel that vibe. I naturally feel a vibe first, and I'll feel an emotion almost immediately after that. But I know that I'm hyper emotional and I lead with my emotions. I almost feel, act, and then think, where other people will do different versions of that. And being able to feel that vibe, like, this just feels kind of weird. And then my emotions will come up or something will happen. I'll be like, oh, this is really weird or this is great or whatever. And then being able to move through it. So, what have you seen, not only in your research, but working with people on this? That is that something that there's kind of a system or a process that people can go through, like look at your vibe first, and then touch on the emotion and then go with the intellect, or what do you think?
That's a great question, actually. Well, I would assume that different people will have different orientations to these different modes of experience, right? So I think you just said a second ago, like you feel first, then comes emotions, then comes thinking, and it's safe to assume that's not true for everyone. Other people might be much more intellectual, much more heady, much more thinking first, and all the other things come second. So I don't want to inherently put an order to them for everyone, right? Um, but for me, though, I'm trying to think of myself, I am a vibes first person, if that makes sense, right? Like I tend to feel the situation first and then think about and analyze what I should do, how I should respond, etc. Right? And so for your listeners or for your viewers on YouTube, I would say don't worry too much about in terms of which one should come first, but rather attain a certain kind of self-awareness, a certain form of self-reflection, right? And what works best for you, right? If you tend to overthink, that's fine. I'm not gonna. We shouldn't judge anyone for that. But like, make room though for these other modes. In other words, make room for the emotional, make room for the intuitive, make room for the vibrational. Likewise, if you are a feel first person, whether it be intuition, vibes, or emotion, that's fine as well. But also don't exclude the analytical, because that's also important, right? Um, a lot of times in our society, with people who are just like totally into vibes, like, well, it's all vibes, which is partially true. I agree with that, but there's more to the human experience than just vibes, right? There's all kinds of modes of experience here. And so the question then for me is, how do we balance all these things out to develop a more well-rounded, a more grounded, more authentic human being, if that makes sense?
That makes total sense. I think that's sort of the pursuit of all of us, even if it's something we don't actively consciously think about. You know, I I had already mentioned I'm very emotional. I know that's how I am. The people that listen to this and watch this know that as well. But I've leaned into that. I understand that that's a thing. I have family members like it's just easy to use my dad as an example because he was always telling me as a kid like think, use your brain, use your brain. and I have to feel, and then I could possibly think, but I have to feel through it first. But that's how people operate, and I do agree with you that there's a balance that we should really look at. How do you be well rounded and lean into the different things that you can? It's almost like personality typing. Somebody will be like, "Oh, this is my personality type, and that's just how I am." It's like, yeah, but there's also other attributes and other things that you can tap into, and knowing the other aspects of it, you can then tie in and see like, oh, I can use a little bit of this, I can use a little bit of that right now, and this is what makes sense for me. I really like the idea of the vibe, because we all feel that. Even if you're a thinker, you still feel that. Like, I've heard thinkers say, I felt a weird vibe with them, and part of me is like, yes, welcome to my side. Yay, come over here, you know? Like, I fucking get it. I've been telling you it's a weird thing or it's a great thing or whatever. Um, but I would really like to be able to figure out what sort of way can we become self aware to be able to actually feel those vibes, because sometimes, and you and I both know this, that there are times where it just goes under the radar, like you feel that thing and you're just moving along, almost like you don't actually think about your breathing, but you're breathing so many times throughout the day that it's just happening. Now, you get used to it and that stuff will happen, but how do we then become self aware? Because I believe self awareness is probably the crux to most things. Like, if you're not aware that there's a problem, you can't do anything with it. If you're not aware that there's an opportunity, you also can't do anything with it. If you're not aware that there's a vibe, you can't do anything with it. So, how does one become self aware and aware of those vibes to then be able to kind of go through a checklist and say, well, all right, I feel this thing or this is happening. Is this an emotional thing? Is it an intuitive thing? Is it really, I'm thinking about, I want it to be this way? Like, you get a vibe with somebody, like you mentioned a first date. There are people that are like, oh, I felt this great vibe. And it's like, did you, or is she just really hot?
Yeah, it's totally
Like,
right. Yeah.
well, she's really hot. And I'm like, well, were you vibing with the wrong head? Or like, what was going on there, you know? So I don't mean to take it down a crude path, but really thinking like, how do we then feel that, but be aware of it to then actually do something with it? And everybody's process is going to be different. But what do you think?
Again, another great question here, and I would begin with something that might sound abstract, but I'll try to explain it. So, try to soften your perception and soften your judgments of other people, judgments of yourself, and judgments of the world. When I say soften, in other words, we're all perceptual creatures. I mean, we can't survive without our senses, right? That's how we're built, right? And of course, we always evaluate and judge to one degree or another. Um, but if you're moving through the world, though, and you're experiencing the world through pre-established social boxes of like, well, this person's attractive, this person's not attractive, or I'm supposed to see it in this kind of a way, interpret the world in this kind of a way. I think that itself is very non-vibey, so to speak, right? Um, so soften your perception, soften your judgment, and allow other parts of your experience and other parts of your being to come to the surface, right? And if you can embody that kind of space, that kind of mental space, emotional space, existential space, you open yourself up to this thing we call the vibe, right? And then once you get to that place, though, then it comes down to developing the ability to distinguish between different kinds of vibes, right? So think of a great musician or a great artist, right? So I love art, I love music, but I'm not an artist, I'm not a music. So when I see a painting, for instance, I say, oh, that's really good. And I can make a few good comments about why I like it, right? But I'm not a trained artist. A trained artist, instead, though, has the training experience to explain exactly why this painting is well done, the tradition it comes from, right? Pointing out things I've never would have seen. Same thing with musicians or musical teachers, things like that, right? And so it's about really an ongoing development of kind of your vibrational vocabulary, right? So, how do you develop a broader vocabulary to understand your experience of different kinds of vibes with different kinds of people in different kinds of situations? But I do think the first step, though, is kind of like I said earlier, softening your perception and your judgments and allowing this other kind of experience to come to the surface.
And that's a really cool thought about softening, because we do perceive, we do judge, no matter what. It just happens. It's how we interpret. Like, something happens and you go, oh, I didn't like that, or I think this, or I feel this, or whatever, and you start to judge. And I think whenever we bring that into a conversation, people will be like, oh, you don't want to judge. We don't want to judge. And yes, we don't. However, we naturally do because we have to experience like, am I about to die or am I safe right now? And you have to judge the situation through that. So that's cool. Being able to soften, I think, really sets us out of the situation to then look at things from kind of a third party perspective. Like if you were a fly on a wall or a wallflower or whatever, you can look at it and go, huh, what's really going on here? Without having your preconceived notions or any thoughts that are like based on patterns that things have happened before, or what have you. So I'm glad that you brought that up, being able to soften. Um, Once we actually soften and start to look at things, it sounds to me like we should then be able to feel those vibes easier.
So going back to like the first date experience or example, I should say, if you go into that first date with a list of expectations of what this person is supposed to be like, right? Then I think you're cutting yourself off to the possibility this might be the one for you, right? Because none of us are going to live up to all the expectations you have, right? And so if you go into that first date, like here are my list of demands, my list of expectations, this person's not meeting all of those, I'm walking out. Well, like first of all, you're giving off a bad vibe. You're giving off a bad judgment, right? The other person probably won't like you because of that, but you're also missing out on being here in the moment, right? How can you be more present? I guess that's another way of thinking about this too. Like, how can you be more present in the moment, more present in the world, right? And being open to what the world has to offer, which is not to say you have to like everything and not judge anything. I'm not saying that at all. But again, if you're living out in pre-established social boxes, if you're living out in your psychological noise inside your mind, you're really cutting yourself off to a lot of what happens around you, right? And I think about vibes and whatnot, um, it's really about opening yourself up to this other realm of experience. And you don't have to get all woo here or anything like that. It's like, no, most people talk about the vibe, most people know about the vibe. And so, how do you open yourself up to this realm of experience about energy, vibes, vibrations, and so on?
So, on that note, and relating to that, and being more open, even softer when it comes to how we judge things, to be able to feel those vibes, what sort of advice would you give to somebody that's on their path towards self mastery?
Well, I mean, tying this back to the vibe and whatnot, right? Um, the question then would become, what is the relationship between self mastery and vibes, right? And then one basic place to begin that journey or that exploration or that question is to keep note of, let's say over the next week or so, keep track of how often either you use the word vibe or how often you hear other people use the word vibe, right? And I would invite your listeners to do this. And I think in a week's time, they'll realize they either use it or hear it a lot more than they think. Then additionally from there, when you use it or when you hear it, how is the word being used? In other words, what's it actually describing? What kind of experience, right? And then from there, though, can you self-reflectively think about like, why I just experienced X and I use this word to describe that. Now, how might I experience that same thing again in the future? And how might this lens or this framework of the vibe help me to articulate that experience more fully, more deeply? Right. Then in terms of self-mastery, like at a more advanced level, um, what I'm about to say, I'm still working on. It's a lifetime of work here. Right? It doesn't stop here. But um, how can I become a how can I have more control over the vibes that I give off? How can I have more control over the vibes that I take in? How can I have more control over not internalizing negative vibes? Right? How can I have more control over understanding, being self-aware of my baseline vibe? Right? So I can give off a vibe for a certain kind of reason, but each person walks around giving off their basic vibe. It's like a personality, right? And so with that, one place to start is with experimentation, right? How might I become more aware of the vibe and start playing with my vibe, right? So next time I go to work, I'll give off this vibe, see how people respond. The following, I'll try to give off a different kind of vibe, see how people respond. So it's a constant experimentation and playing with different kinds of vibes and seeing what kind of response you get in return. And from there, they'll use that as information to help you develop a vibe that's more authentic to you, that makes you happier, gives you more balance, more joy, and so on.
I could feel myself getting excited about that. Like the cataloging of things or like tracking things doesn't always work for people, and sometimes I hear that even, and I'm like, ugh. Like there's just so many things to track and like work through and try to figure out. But that of like feeling the vibes and being able to understand and play with the vibe. You get to test different things out. And I'm glad you brought that up. There's like different people think like, oh, my personality, I'm just constantly angry. It's like, well, not really. There's actually trauma. Like you need to work through that. That's why you're angry. But there are certain vibes that people will give off that are symptoms of a problem. But I'm right there with you that there's like a core vibe that we all have. Like I know at the core of who I am, I'm joyous and extroverted, but I'm really very introverted at times. But when I feel my own vibe, I'm like curious and I'm doing things and I'm asking questions and I'm excited about things and that vibe that I'm giving off. And we all have that natural vibe. So that what a cool thing to be able to say, basically like take that vibe, understand what that is, or at least see what it is, and then test it out. Try out different versions of it and try out different things. Um, it's really also interesting to think about how many times people use the word vibe, but I also wonder, is there any other word or a synonymous word or something that people are using? Because if vibe isn't part of what they say, is there something else that you have experienced that people say that isn't really even coming to mind right now?
Sure. Well, with the word vibe, there are plenty of variations. So vibe, vibes in the plural, vibrations, um, feel, energy, mood, atmosphere, right? All these kinds of things. I know someone lives over in Germany. She's originally from America, but has been in Germany for a long time. And I was talking to her about the vibe. I said, do they use the word vibe over there? And she said, yes, but it usually translates into more of atmosphere. But it means the same kind of thing, right? Then I know in Portugal, I've talked to people in Portugal about this. And in Portugal, at least in some places, they'll speak Portuguese, French, English, Spanish, etc. Right? But they will use the actual word vibe in Portugal, right, in the English version. But they also use the word waves, right? So like something's like going through space and time, like a wave. So there are different, let's say, cross cultural translations of this word vibe. Um, I know one of the words the younger kids are using nowadays is the Riz, short for charisma. All right, someone's charismatic, like oh, like, that person's got a lot of Riz, and I think that relates to the vibe. I mean, charisma and vibe go hand in hand, right? So the Riz I think works really well. I think it's funny. I think it's a funny way of describing the vibe. So yeah, there are all kinds of ways of talking about it.
But we're all still talking about the same thing, which that is so awesome. It's just exciting that there's just different ways of being able to language your way through it in a sense. Like this is what these people are saying, and this is how other people think about it. But we're all talking about the same thing. Makes me think of music. Music is a universal language, and the vibe is a universal feeling that we can all be privy to. And it sounds like we can work on that muscle as well. Well, man, I appreciate you being on the show. I appreciate you actually sticking with being the integrous person you are and getting that tattoo on your back. Um, but really, thank you for being here and talking about this and unearthing some of these because we all have these feelings and these vibes, but we don't always really know what to do with them or why they're around or what we can do. So before I let you go, where can people find you and where can they connect with you?
Yeah, sure. So my latest project on the Vibe is called 20 Minute Vibe. So it's 20minutevibe.com, my website. And so it's the number two, the number zero, so 20minutevibe.com. And it's really a space to help people understand the vibe, right? So it offers up vibe related content for people who are intellectually curious, right? And so I have videos, essays, I have self-paced video courses they can look up. They can look me up on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, etc. And again, though, it's really just helping people understand the vibe. So most people aren't going to sit down for 10, 20, or 30 years and study the vibe, right? That's not a reality, right? But I've done that, though. I'm trying to share my knowledge with the people. And so it's called 20-minute vibe because it offers up short chunks of information that are very accessible. So spend 5 minutes a day, 10 minutes a day, or 20 minutes a day thinking about the vibe, thinking about all these different kinds of experiences. And hopefully you too can have more of a mastery over this thing we call the vibe.
Well put, man. Really, really, and thank you for putting the amount of time, effort, and energy into it as you have. You're right. Not everybody will put 20, 30, 40 years into something, but that's where purpose comes into play and you figuring out what your purpose is and being able to share that out. I appreciate that I have a platform to be able to share this knowledge. where people can put that 20 minutes in, but be able to have a lot of information from you. So again, Jason, thank you so much for being on the call today. I appreciate your time.
Thank you. I appreciate it.